The Cossacks. Chapter 5. The Youngest Cossack. On the third day after their meeting with Captain Ivan Koltso, they reached the Cossack village where Yermak Timofeyev lived. It stood by the Volga at the point where it flows closest to the Don. That's D-O-N, still. The three travelers had halted at several other settlements en route, and Yermak had had messengers sent to neighboring districts to summon the representatives of the other colonies for a meeting at the next full moon. A horse had been found for Mitya at their first halt, and now he rode between the two men. He peered forward eagerly as they drew near to their destination. He could see the densely packed encampment, which consisted of tents and wooden cabins built on stilts, all huddling together at the foot of a low hill in front of a fringe of forest. At the top of the hill was a tall wooden turret, and from it on either side ran a palisade of planed tree trunks, which enclosed watchtower and village into a rough square. Mitya was trying to make out which was the entrance to the stockade when he heard a buzz of noise coming from the village. As they approached, the sounds grew in volume until he could make out what they were shouting. "Yermak Timofeyev!" over and over again. A few moments later, a crowd of men came pouring out to meet them. Some were bareheaded, others wore the Cossack fur hat, some were dressed in tunics, others in short jerkins. They had dashed out just as soon as they heard the call from the sentinels in the watchtower. There was a sea of strange faces, smooth and wrinkled, brick red and brown. Arms waved, hands reached out to them wherever they went, and above all rang the joyous cry, "Yermak Timofeyev, it's good to have you back. God bless you, Yermak Timofeyev." "Greetings, brothers," called Yermak, jumping down from his horse. The men surrounded him, kissing his cheek and shaking his hand, still repeating, "It's good to have you back." They pulled him along with them into the village, talking all the time. As Yermak answered the questions, his eyes took in everything, the state of the houses and the tents and the strength of the stockade. Mitya and Ivan Koltso kept their distance. "Well, laddie," asked Ivan, turning to the boy, "do you think that you're going to like it here?" "Why shouldn't I?" answered Mitya. "Only I was wondering if I shall have time to get used to it all before we have to leave." "So you heard what Yermak and I were discussing then?" "Yes, sir." "And what is your opinion? Which way do you think we should choose, eh?" "It isn't easy to decide. You both agreed that the south is ruled out because the Nogai Khan is lying in wait to have his revenge for the looting of Saraichik. We can't go east into the steppes, or we may starve. Murashkin will be coming from the northwest. So that leaves only the north." "Well argued, my boy. But how shall we live in the north?" "I don't know." "We shall have to find out, then." Mitya's head felt heavy. He was not used to the crude rye spirits they had drunk at supper, and he felt most peculiar. It was his first night in the Cossack village, and in spite of the alcohol he could not fall asleep. He lay on a wooden settle in Yermak's cabin, which was the one nearest to the watchtower. Until then, Yermak had lived alone, but now he shared his quarters with Mitya. There was no sign of Yermak, but the boy waited, listening to the noises that penetrated from the outside. The Cossacks were still celebrating Yermak's return, and their endless songs pierced the darkness. Mitya had supposed that Yermak was still with them, but not long before he thought that he had heard footsteps outside the hut, and he half wondered if Yermak might not be sitting on the steps below the front door. He felt wholly insecure when Yermak was not near. Everything was so strange and unsettling. During the past few weeks, he had learned that the Cossacks had to be prepared for attacks at any hour, and especially at night. There were Tartars living across the river on the opposite bank of the Volga. Again Mitya listened as more footsteps approached, but there were two men this time. He could hear them talking. "What made the captain bring us that young whippersnapper?" babbled a thick voice. "Why should we play at nurse to please him? That's what I want to know." And the speaker hiccuped loudly. It doesn't worry me. Let him bring whom he likes, answered the other. It's Yermak's business, not ours. Oh, yes, it is. We all have a say here. But anyone can become a Cossack if he's a Christian and knows how to fight. You don't think that babe in swaddling clothes is any use at fighting, do you? And a wave of hiccups overwhelmed him. He'll have to fight if he stays with us, or he'll soon be sprouting cherub's wings. That's right. There was a bleating laugh which penetrated as far as the house. Suddenly the footsteps stopped short, and Medea could hear the less truculent Cossack whispering, "Quiet, it's the captain." Medea looked out of the window without making a sound. He saw the men ducking swiftly, dodging beneath the piles on which the house stood. "Don't meddle in affairs which you do not understand, are no concern of yours anyway," came a stern voice, "and you can save your wit for a better object, Ilya. It's high time the two of you were in your beds." Yermak's tall figure had risen out of the darkness by the side of the two men, so he must have been sitting on the steps after all. Medea was grateful to Yermak for speaking up for him. In spite of the malice of Ilya and his friend, the lad's loneliness seemed less hard to bear, and his self-confidence returned. He leaned out of the window and spat. Then, with a sigh of relief, he slipped back to his bed. Shortly afterwards, Yermak entered the room. He had to stoop as he came through the doorway. Medea saw him throw his belt and his long great coat onto a stool, and then he sat down on the broad bench and tugged at his riding boots. "Can I help you?" asked Medea shyly. Yermak's head turned abruptly. "Aren't you asleep yet?" "I was waiting for you." Growled Yermak. "So that you could take off my boots for me? I can do that by myself, thank you." The first boot sailed through the air, and the second followed a few moments later. "I have decided that you must take the oath tomorrow." Medea sat up with a start. "Oh, thank you, Yermak. That will do," said Yermak. And he stretched himself out on the bench opposite Medea. "You still haven't told me why you were waiting up for me." "It was because you are so worried about the future." "What of that? Why should it stop you from sleeping?" "Well, I know I can't really help you or give you good advice, but sometimes things don't seem quite so bad when you're not quite alone." Yermak did not reply at once. He lay there in the stillness, listening not only to Medea's words, but the tone of his voice as well. Then he answered curtly, "It's best to be alone." It sounded harsh, and the darkness did nothing to soften it. "For years I've known nothing else," added Yermak, and this time there was a hint of kindness, rebuilding the frail bridge between them. "I know," came the boy's voice, muffled. "How?" "You are so different from the others. None of them became Cossacks for reasons like yours." "Silence!" Again Medea could hear the hardness of a man who will not tolerate any opposition. Then once more came a gentle word as compensation for the blow. "Go to sleep now, Medea." There were 2 rows of Cossacks, and they stood facing each other. At the far end were Yermak and Ivan Koltso, the most senior in the rank of those present. At the other end was Medea. His face was pale with excitement, and he was still wearing the dark tunic in which he had left home. He knew that all eyes were turned on him, and that many of those present did not trouble to conceal their contempt. Medea was as tall as most of the men present, although he was barely 15. But his build was still slight, and his face was that of a child, in which one could read every passing emotion. What damned him most, however, was that there was no sign of a beard on his chin. At last Yermak thought it was time to put an end to the staring. "Brothers," he began, "while I was away, I met a youth who wants to join our community. None of us were asked why we wanted to become Cossacks, and similarly, we shall refrain from probing his motives. But whoever joins us must accept our laws, and he must be a Christian prepared to fight for his faith. He must obey his captain, in whose election he has a voice every year. He must be ready to take up arms as he is ordered, and to share his booty with his comrades. In return, he shall be given a horse, his weapons, and his share of our food and drink. Now that you have heard all this, I put the question to you. Are you, Dmitri Nikolaev Yelnikov, prepared to enter our community and to keep faith with us, your brothers? I am. Then swear it by God. Mitya raised his right hand. I swear it by God. Then he passed between the rows and received from Yermak's hand a dagger, a saber, and a tall bearskin cap. Next he was led into the guard-room, and the Cossacks thronged round him as he was handed a pair of riding boots, a long great coat, a tunic, shirt, and belt. When he had dressed, Yermak went with him to the field where the horses were grazing. You are in luck, said Yermak. At the moment we have more horses than we need. You can pick one for yourself. This was unexpected, and Mitya hesitated. They are all such fine ones, he acknowledged, and his eyes went from one to the other. A black mare came galloping up to the two men and whinnied loudly. Mitya was about to say, I should like that one, when he saw Yermak stretch out his hand and snap his finger coaxingly. Here, Swallow, come here, he beckoned. Is that your own horse? Asked Mitya. Yes, isn't she a beauty? I have never known her equal either for speed or stamina. It looked as if the black mare's approach had been a signal to the others, for they all came trotting up behind her. What about that sorrel over there? Does it belong to anyone special? No, I don't think so. Very well, then. I'll have that one. Good, said Yermak. But don't think that you can just mount and ride it. We haven't had it long. It was captured out in the steppes. We call it tarpan. Do you know what that is? It's a wild horse, isn't it? He said cautiously, not sure if he should admit that he knew the word. Yes, how do you know? Volodya told me. He is Vasily Metyanov's slave, you see, and he is a Tartar from Kazan. When the Tsar defeated the Prince of Kazan, many of his people were taken prisoner and sent to Moscow. They were sold as slaves, and Vasily happened to buy Volodya. It was he who told me that there are hordes of wild horses living in the steppes, and that they roam in packs led by the strongest stallion. Volodya said that they are hard to capture, but if you succeed in breaking one in, then you have a real treasure, a horse with swift hoofs and a small appetite, and that is very important, in the vast dry plains. And once you have tamed and ridden it, he said you'll never want any other horse. Once upon a time there were creatures in the steppes who were half man and half horse. Mitya broke off suddenly. I'm not sure if that is true, he apologized, but Volodya told me, ... Volodya is no fool, I should say. You are quite right. Have you heard of these creatures too? Yes, there are many legends about them. The Scythians, who lived here centuries ago, are said to have descended from such centaurs, as they are called, and I often think there may be a grain of truth in the story, for this has always been a land of men and their horses. There are no merchants or farmers, only horsemen like us, Cossacks, and the Tartars before us. The next few days flew by. Mitya hardly knew if it was day or night. He used to go down to the Volga with the others to empty the fish traps and to set new ones. Often he helped to prepare the food in the cookhouse, and whenever he had time he ran out to the fields where the horses were grazing and spent time with the sorrel. When he returned, more often than not, he was limping and dragging his feet like an old woman. The horse he had selected was a tough nut to crack. There were no two ways about it. It was hard work just getting hold of it. And even when Mitya had caught it, he had first to mount it and then to keep his seat. He was used to riding at the Metyanovs' farm, but he had never seen such a savage, unpredictable brute as this, let alone tried to ride one. Mitya could never guess whether it was going to buck or to rear, and so he went flying over its head or its crupper more times than he could count. And each time he was thrown, the horse ran away, and he had the trouble of catching it again. One evening, Mitya was tossing on his wooden bed, groaning with all his aches and pains. The sorrel isn't coming on too well, is it? Remarked Yermak. It's all right. Wouldn't you like another horse instead? Certainly not. Yermak looked at the boy. I like your spirit, lad. You don't sulk about a few bruises. And this way, at least, you should be a first-rate horseman by the time you've finished. A few days later, Yermak spoke to him again. I was watching you today, Midia. I like the way you're handling your horse, but I hope you don't beat it, do you? No, of course not. How can it ever trust me if I beat it? That's the way, Midia. Yermak's approval gave the boy great pleasure. The next day, Midia was detailed for his first sentry duty. He was not looking forward to it, for he had not yet learned to make friends with any of the others, and he could see that they did not take him seriously because he was so young. Although breaking in the sorrel was both arduous and discouraging, he would have much preferred tackling the horse again rather than face the guard-room. 7 Cossacks shared the watch with him. He barely knew their names, but it was not long before he realized that one of them was the aggressive Ilya, who had spoken against Midia on his first night and who had to swallow Yermak's reprimand. He stared offensively at Midia, but he did not dare to provoke trouble as long as Yermak was in the offing. Midia glanced at the others warily. 2 of them were old men with gray beards, and their faces and hands were brown and tanned like hide. One of them had an empty eye socket. The next in age appeared to be Ilya. He was lean and sinewy, and he had black hair and eyes which reminded Midia of Volodya's. He wondered if Ilya was of Tartar origin. The 4 remaining Cossacks were quite young. Excuse me. One of them had an angry red scar on his forehead. They sprawled on the benches, smoking and gossiping while Midia listened. As soon as Yermak had gone, they started speaking more freely. I'd like to know what's wrong with the old man these days. He's running round in circles like a wolf when the hunters are closing in. I have a feeling there's something brewing. A feeling? Only the young pay attention to their feelings, interrupted one of the old men impatiently. I rely on my eyes and my ears. And what do they tell you? That there's something in the wind when Yermak goes about looking so preoccupied. He wouldn't have called the council meeting for nothing either. But what's it all about? You lads are so impatient. What are the possibilities? I know Yermak pretty well, and I'm sure he's planning an expedition. Do you think it will be like that time we attacked Saraichik? And I've said that word twice now. Saraichik. Saraichik. I don't pretend to know, but it must be something on the grand scale. Midia pretended he was absorbed in looking out of the window. If only they knew, he thought to himself. Without warning, someone prodded him in the side. Hey, baby, don't you know what's going on? After all, you share his quarters. It was Ilya's voice. Midia knew it without turning. You don't think he confides his plans to me, do you? I'm the youngest here, and I haven't shown my mettle yet. The others, who had waited with interest for Midia's answer, were silent but favorably impressed. No one had really expected him to supply them with secret information, but even less had they expected him to admit his youth and inexperience. He had taken the wind out of Ilya's sails. But Ilya was not put out, especially as everyone had heard the boy's spirited answer. Your medal, oh-ho, he said. You can show us that here now. Come on, let's see the color of your sword. Ilya had drawn his own saber as he spoke, and he took up his guard, waiting for Midia. His eyes were flashing. As the first flush of excitement faded, Midia felt his body growing icy cold. A wave of hatred surged through him. He whipped his sword from its sheath and braced his feet. Come on, then, he panted. The one-eyed Cossack leaped up from the bench. Are you mad, Ilya? You know perfectly well that Yermak has forbidden dueling. The boy hasn't hurt you in any way. Yermak would have you beaten to a pulp if you found out what had happened. I don't take orders from you, Igor Alexiev, he retorted. I don't take orders from you, Igor Alexiev, retorted Ilya. Mind your own business. If you don't shut that great mouth of yours, You'll feel the edge of my blade, was the firm answer. Put up your sword, Midia. This is no way to prove your courage. You'll have occasion enough presently. Don't forget, we are on duty now. Come on, fellows, look sharp. 2 men to the top of the tower, and the rest of you down to the posts by the river. And that ends this chapter.